The deputy noticed her third Tuesday in a row, sitting in the same patch of dirt behind the courthouse like some kind of broken prayer nobody wanted to hear. Mara Blackwood scratched at the ground with a weathered stick, her dark hair hanging in tangles around a face that never looked up, never spoke, never acknowledged the world that had forgotten her existed. The townspeople of Cedar Junction stepped around her the way they'd step around a sleeping dog, careful not to get too close, muttering under their breath about that crazy Indian girl who drew pictures in the dirt like a child. But Deputy Tom Marshall had eyes that caught details other folks missed, and what he saw in that patch of earth made his blood run cold. Those weren't childish scribbles or meaningless scratches. They were maps. Perfect, precise architectural drawings that showed every building in Cedar Junction with disturbing accuracy, complete with measurements, doorways, and windows positioned exactly where they stood in real life. The kind of maps that took training to make, the kind that required someone to have studied every inch of the town from the inside out. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Marshall crouched down beside her, close enough to see the intricate detail of her work. The girl's stick moved with surgical precision, carving lines and symbols into the packed earth like she was following blueprints burned into her memory. But it was what she'd drawn that made his throat tighten with recognition. There was Peterson's General Store, complete with the back room addition he'd built last spring. There was the church with its new bell tower. There was Doc Henley's office with the side entrance most people didn't even know existed. "Miss," Marshall said softly, keeping his voice gentle so he wouldn't spook her. "Those are some mighty fine drawings you got there." Mara's stick froze mid-stroke. Her shoulders tensed like a rabbit sensing a predator, but she didn't look up. Instead, she began scratching over her work frantically, trying to erase the evidence of whatever compulsion had driven her to create these impossible maps. "Easy now," Marshall continued, noting how her hands shook as she destroyed her careful work. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just curious about your artistic talents." That's when he saw it. Half hidden under the fresh scratches, a building he recognized all too well. Judge Blackthorne's mansion, drawn in meticulous detail, complete with what looked like additional rooms beneath the main structure. Rooms that shouldn't exist, spaces that weren't on any official plans filed with the county. But this girl had mapped them out like she'd walked through every corridor, counted every door, memorized every secret the judge's house contained. Marshall's pulse quickened as he studied the partially erased drawing. Judge Cornelius Blackthorne was the most powerful man in 3 counties, a territorial appointee with connections reaching all the way to Washington. His mansion sat on the hill overlooking Cedar Junction like a castle ruling over peasants, and nobody questioned what went on behind those expensive windows. Nobody except, apparently, a mute Indian girl who drew maps in the dirt with mathematical precision. "Where did you learn to draw like this?" Marshall asked, though he suspected she wouldn't answer. Mara Blackwood hadn't spoken a word since arriving in town 6 months ago, carried in the back of a supply wagon like damaged cargo. But as she looked up at him for the first time, her dark eyes blazing with intelligence and something deeper, something that looked like barely contained fury, Marshall realized he was staring at someone who held secrets worth killing for. And in a town where 3 young women had vanished over the past year without a trace, those secrets might be the key to horrors nobody wanted to imagine. The stick in her hand began moving again. This time carving a single word into the dirt with letters sharp as accusations: help. 3 years earlier, the autumn wind carried smoke and screams across the Apache camp as soldiers in blue coats descended like locusts on everything Mara had ever known. She was 14 then, her real name still Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her father's tongue. But blossoms don't survive when men with rifles decide your people have lived too long in one place. The raid came at dawn when the cooking fires were still cold and the warriors were scattered on hunting parties. Mara watched from her family's wickiup as her mother pressed a small leather pouch into her hands, whispering urgent words that would haunt her forever. Remember everything, little tracker. Your father's gift lives in your mind. Use it to survive. The pouch contained sacred earth from their ancestral burial grounds, but more importantly, it held the weight of her mother's final blessing before a cavalry saber ended her voice forever. Captain Hayes led the attack with methodical brutality, his men systematically destroying everything that couldn't be sold or transported. But Mara noticed something strange about the raid. While other children were herded together like livestock, rough hands specifically sought her out. This one, a soldier said, checking a piece of paper against her face. Matches the description. Dark hair, tribal markings, about 14 summers. They weren't just taking prisoners randomly. Someone had ordered her capture specifically. The journey to Cedar Junction took 3 weeks in chains, bouncing in the back of a supply wagon with 6 other captured children. Most of them cried or raged or begged for mercy in languages their captors couldn't understand. But Mara watched and listened and remembered everything with the photographic precision her father had trained into her since childhood. Every landmark, every face, every conversation between the soldiers who thought she couldn't understand English. She learned that Judge Blackthorne had paid extra for her specifically, requesting the daughter of Joseph Ayana, the Apache tracker whose legendary memory had made him famous among white settlers and Army scouts alike. Can map any territory after seeing it once, she heard Captain Hayes tell his lieutenant. Girl probably inherited the same gift. Judge wants someone who can remember things without writing them down. The memory training her father had given her wasn't just for tracking game through the wilderness. It was a sacred Apache tradition passed down through generations of warriors and scouts, a way of preserving knowledge when writing was impossible. The white man trusts his marks on paper, her father had taught her. But paper burns, gets lost, tells lies. The mind trained properly never forgets, never lies, never betrays its keeper. Now she understood why Blackthorne wanted that gift for himself. When they finally reached the judge's mansion, Mara made a decision that would keep her alive for 3 years. She would pretend to be mute, broken by trauma, a damaged servant girl incapable of understanding or remembering the secrets she witnessed. The performance began the moment Blackthorne's cold eyes examined his new acquisition like a man inspecting livestock. Traumatized into silence, Captain Hayes explained, counting the gold coins Blackthorne handed him. Hasn't spoken a word since we took her. But she's strong, young, trainable. Perfect for domestic work. The lie came so easily that Mara realized Hayes had sold many children this way, packaging their suffering as convenient features for potential buyers. Blackthorne studied her with calculating eyes that missed nothing, and for a terrifying moment, Mara thought he could see through her deception. But then he nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with his purchase. Excellent. Silent servants are the most valuable kind. They see everything, remember nothing, and never repeat what they shouldn't. If only he knew that her silence was carefully chosen strategy, and her memory was recording every detail of his words with perfect clarity. The first night in Blackthorne's basement servant quarters. Lying on a thin mattress surrounded by 3 other girls who whispered their fears in the darkness, Mara clutched her mother's leather pouch and made a sacred vow. She would remember everything. Every face, every name, every crime, every secret corridor in this house of horrors. And someday, when the time was right, her silence would end and her testimony would bring justice to the man who thought he'd bought himself a perfect, voiceless witness. But as she heard the first girl crying behind locked doors somewhere above her, Mara realized that surviving 3 years in this place would test her father's memory training in ways no Apache warrior had ever imagined. The white man's evil was deeper and more systematic than any enemy her people had ever faced, and she was now the only witness to horrors that would make strong men weep. Deputy Marshal's boots crunched on the courthouse gravel as he approached the dirt patch where Mara sat frozen, her stick hovering over the word, help, like she'd forgotten how to breathe. The morning sun cast long shadows between them, but Tom could see terror radiating from her small frame like heat from a forge. When he took another step closer, she exploded into motion, frantically scratching over her maps with desperate strokes, erasing 3 hours of meticulous work in seconds. "Easy, miss," Tom said, crouching down slowly with his hands visible. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just want to understand what you're drawing." But his gentle words only made her panic worse. She attacked the dirt like it was on fire, grinding her stick so hard it snapped in half, then using her bare hands to scrape away every line and symbol until nothing remained but churned earth. When the destruction was complete, Mara hugged her knees to her chest and rocked back and forth, making a low humming sound that reminded Tom of his grandmother's funeral songs. Her dark hair fell like a curtain around her face, but he could see tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Whatever those maps had shown, they were important enough to risk exposure for, and terrifying enough to destroy rather than explain. Tom pulled out his own pencil and a piece of paper from his vest pocket, placing them gently in the dirt between them. "Can you draw it again? Just for me?" Mara's eyes darted to the paper, then to his face, searching for deception or trap. After a long moment, her trembling hand reached for the pencil. What she drew this time made Tom's blood freeze in his veins. The judge's mansion appeared on paper with architectural precision that would have impressed a surveyor, but it was what lay beneath the familiar structure that stole his breath. A honeycomb of underground rooms connected by narrow tunnels, spreading out like cancer roots beneath the hill. Each chamber was marked with careful symbols, and beside several of them, words written in shaky English, loud crying, begging stop, no more screaming. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, studying the detailed underworld that supposedly existed beneath Blackthorn's respectable facade. "You lived there? In the judge's house?" Mara nodded once, then pointed to a tiny room in the deepest part of the basement complex. Her finger tapped the paper 3 times, then she pointed to herself. Tom leaned closer, noting how she'd drawn air vents connecting the rooms, maintenance shafts barely wide enough for a child, and what looked like peepholes between chambers. "You could see into other rooms? Hear what was happening?" Another nod, this one accompanied by fresh tears that splattered onto the paper, smearing some of the careful lines. The deputy's mind raced as he studied her architectural nightmare. If even half of what she'd drawn was real, Judge Blackthorn's mansion contained a hidden prison complex that would make the territorial penitentiary look merciful. But the symbols marking each chamber told a story that made his stomach clench with rage. Numbers beside each room: 3 girls, 2 girls, 1 girl alone. Ages written in careful script: maybe 16, very young, Sarah's age. Sarah. Tom's voice cracked as he pointed to that particular notation. His own sister had vanished 8 months ago. Supposedly run off with a traveling merchant according to Sheriff Brady's official report. But looking at Mara's terrified face, he realized there might be a much darker explanation for Sarah's disappearance. Mara began drawing again, this time sketching the tunnel system that connected Blackthorn's basement to other buildings in town. The lines spread out like spider web, reaching toward the church, the bank, even the sheriff's office. Each connection was marked with dates and times, suggesting a systematic schedule for moving human cargo through Cedar Junction's underground arteries. "How many girls?" Tom asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Mara held up both hands, fingers spread wide. Then again. Then again. Then 2 more fingers. 32. She'd witnessed 32 different girls pass through Blackthorn's chambers over the 3 years of her captivity. The deputy stared at the paper, trying to process the enormity of what she was revealing. A human trafficking operation operating under everyone's noses, protected by the most powerful man in the territory, using the town's own underground infrastructure as a transportation system. And this broken girl with her dirt maps was the only witness to crimes that would shock the entire territory. "Where are they now?" Tom whispered. "The girls, where did they go?" Mara's pencil moved across the paper one final time, drawing symbols that looked like graves, wagon wheels heading in different directions, and what might have been ships sailing toward distant harbors. Some had been sold, some transported, and some, Tom realized with growing horror, would never be found alive. As clouds gathered overhead and the first drops of rain began falling, threatening to wash away her paper testimony, Tom made a decision that would either save dozens of lives or get them both killed. "We're going to that house," he said grimly. "Tonight. And you're going to show me every tunnel, every room, every hiding place you mapped in your mind." Mara's eyes widened with terror, but she nodded slowly. After 3 years of silent witness, she was finally ready to speak for the dead and fight for the living, even if it meant returning to the place that had taught her what true horror looked like. 2 years ago, Mara's second year of captivity. The screaming started at midnight on a Tuesday in October, echoing through the air vents that connected every room in Blackthorn's underground maze. Mara pressed her eye to the gap in the servants' quarters wall, the same peephole she discovered 3 months into her captivity when the judge's architect had built these chambers with ventilation shafts that doubled as perfect surveillance points for anyone small enough to navigate them. Through the narrow opening, she watched 2 men drag a Chinese girl down the stone steps into the basement complex. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, her black hair torn loose from its careful braids, her simple blue dress ripped at the shoulder from fighting her captors. Blood trickled from her split lip, but her dark eyes burned with defiance that reminded Mara painfully of her own mother's final moments. "Please," the girl sobbed in accented English. "My family pay debt. We work harder, give more money. I no belong here." But Judge Blackthorn's cold laughter filled the chamber like poison gas, and Mara knew with sinking heart that begging would only make him enjoy this more. Blackthorn stepped into view, his expensive suit immaculate despite the underground setting, his silver hair perfectly groomed even at this late hour. Behind him came Sheriff Brady, his badge glinting in the lantern light, and Coleman Hayes, the businessman who owned half the shops on Main Street. The 3 men moved with practiced coordination, suggesting this wasn't their first time conducting business in these hidden chambers. "Miss Chen," Blackthorn said conversationally, pulling out a leather ledger and consulting it like a banker reviewing accounts. "Your father's gambling debts to my associates total $800, plus interest accumulated over 6 months of non-payment. That brings your family's obligation to exactly $1,200. Sarah Chen lifted her chin defiantly despite her terror. "We pay. My father work laundry, my mother sew. We save money, pay honest debt." Her broken English carried the weight of desperate hope, but Mara had heard enough of these conversations to know hope was a luxury not permitted in Blackthorn's basement. Sheriff Brady stepped forward, his familiar voice making Mara's skin crawl with recognition. "See, that's where you're wrong, girl. Your family's had 6 months to make good on their debts, and all they've managed is excuses and promises." He gestured around the stone chamber with mock sympathy. Judge Blackthorn's offered them a very generous alternative arrangement. Coleman Hayes opened a second ledger, his merchant's mind reducing human suffering to neat columns of figures. "Based on current market rates for domestic labor in the territorial mining camps, we calculate your working value at approximately $50 per month." His pencil scratched against paper as he performed calculations with the casual efficiency of a man pricing livestock. 24 months of service should satisfy your family's obligation completely." The lie was so smoothly delivered that Sarah almost seemed to believe it. 2 years, she whispered. "I worked 2 years, family debt finished." But Mara had watched this same conversation play out with 4 other girls over the past months, and she knew the truth that Sarah would learn too late. There would be no 24 months. There would be additional fees for room and board, medical care, clothing, food. Interest would compound monthly. Behavioral infractions would add penalties. The debt would grow like cancer until Sarah Chen disappeared entirely, replaced by a broken creature who existed only to generate profit for the three men who turned kidnapping into a business model. Exactly, Blackthorne confirmed, his smile warm as a grandfather's, poisonous as a snake's bite. You'll work off your family's debt through honest labor, and everyone benefits from the arrangement. He gestured toward a heavy wooden door marked with the number 7. Your accommodations are quite comfortable, and you'll have companionship from other girls working off similar family obligations. Through the ventilation system, Mara could hear sobbing from rooms 3, 5, and 8, where previous debt workers had learned the true nature of their situations. Sarah's eyes darted toward the sounds, her expression shifting from hope to growing horror as she realized what kind of work Blackthorne had in mind for her. Sheriff Brady's hand moved to his gun belt, not drawing the weapon but making its presence known. Now, Miss Chen, you can accept this generous offer and begin working immediately, or we can discuss the criminal charges your family faces for fraud, theft, and conspiracy to defraud legitimate businessmen. His tone remained conversational, but the threat underneath was sharp as a blade. Coleman Hayes consulted his pocket watch with theatrical precision. The evening train leaves for the territorial capital in 3 hours. Plenty of time to transport your parents to face federal charges if you prefer that alternative to honest work. The casual mention of her family's vulnerability hit Sarah like a physical blow, and Mara watched the girl's defiance crumble into desperate compliance. I work, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her bruised cheeks. I pay debt. Family stay safe. The words came out like prayers to gods who'd stopped listening long ago, and Mara felt her own heart breaking for this girl who still believed fairness and mercy existed in Blackthorne's world. As the three men escorted Sarah toward room 7, their voices carried clearly through the ventilation system, discussing logistics with the casual efficiency of merchants arranging shipments. Hayes has buyers in Denver, Brady said. Railroad camp supervisors pay premium for young Chinese girls. Clean, hardworking, grateful for any treatment better than what they've known. Excellent, Blackthorne replied. But let's give her a few weeks to adjust first. Break in the new merchandise properly before transport. Their laughter echoed through the underground chambers like demons celebrating another soul claimed for hell. From her hidden vantage point, Mara memorized every detail of the transaction, adding Sarah Chen's story to the growing catalog of horrors burned into her memory. Room 7, Chinese girl, 16 years old, family debt of $1,200, parents threatened with federal charges. But most importantly, she'd witnessed the partnership between the three most powerful men in Cedar Junction, the unholy alliance that made their crimes possible. As Sarah's sobs joined the chorus of despair echoing through Blackthorne's underground kingdom, Mara pressed her face against the cold stone wall and made another silent vow to her mother's memory. She would remember Sarah Chen's name, her story, her courage, and someday she would make sure the world knew what had happened to the girl who believed honest work could buy her family's freedom. The sound of metal grinding against stone told her the door to room 7 was being locked from the outside, and Sarah Chen's journey into hell had officially begun. Dr. Helena Cross had delivered half the babies in Cedar Junction and pronounced the other half's grandparents dead, but she'd never seen anything like the papers Deputy Marshal spread across her examination table. The maps covered every surface of her small office, overlapping and interconnected like the circulatory system of some massive, hidden organism that pulsed beneath their familiar town. Tom, these drawings, she breathed, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles to study the precise measurements and architectural details. This level of accuracy, the mathematical precision of the proportions. This isn't the work of someone who's merely observant. She traced her finger along the perfectly scaled blueprint of her own medical office, noting how Mara had included the hidden compartment behind her medicine cabinet that she'd never mentioned to another living soul. Mara sat in the corner chair, her small frame dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding her, but her dark eyes tracked every movement of Dr. Cross's examination. When the doctor held up the map of the courthouse, Mara nodded once, then reached for a fresh piece of paper. Without hesitation, her hand began moving across the page, recreating the entire building from memory in perfect detail, including the basement storage rooms that had been sealed off for 15 years. "Good Lord," Dr. Cross whispered, watching the architectural drawing take shape with mechanical precision. "She's not just remembering what she's seen. She's reproducing it with surveyor-level accuracy." The doctor turned to study Mara's face, noting the intense concentration in her expression. "This is photographic memory, Tom. True eidetic recall. I've read about it in medical journals, but I've never witnessed it firsthand." Deputy Marshal pulled up a chair beside them, his voice tight with urgency. "Doc, I need you to look at something else. Something that's going to make you sick." He spread out Mara's drawing of the underground tunnel system, pointing to the symbols and notations that marked each chamber. "She's mapped out an entire network beneath the town. And if what she's showing me is real, we've got crimes happening right under our feet that make highway robbery look like church social." Dr. Cross studied the underground complex, her medical mind immediately grasping the implications of the careful notations. "These symbols beside each room, they're medical observations, aren't they?" She looked at Mara, who nodded slowly. "You were documenting injuries, illnesses, the physical condition of people being held in these chambers." Mara reached for another piece of paper, this time drawing what looked like a calendar system with dates, names, and movement patterns connecting different buildings throughout Cedar Junction. Each line represented a person being transported through the tunnel network, with arrival and departure times marked in meticulous detail. She's been tracking people, Tom realized, studying the flow charts that turned human trafficking into a visible pattern. "Look at these dates. September 15th, Sarah Chen arrives at Blackthorns, October 2nd, moved to church basement, October 8th. Transported to railway station." His finger traced the route across multiple maps, showing how girls were systematically moved through different locations before disappearing entirely. Dr. Cross felt her stomach clench as she recognized some of the names on Mara's charts. Lucy Morrison, the blacksmith's daughter. Everyone thought she ran away with that traveling salesman. She pointed to a series of movements showing Lucy's path through the underground network. But according to this, she was held in 3 different locations over 2 weeks before being moved to what looks like a railroad shipment. Mara stood up suddenly and began drawing on a new sheet, this time creating what looked like a business ledger with profit calculations and shipping schedules. The numbers beside each girl's name made Dr. Cross's blood boil with rage. They're not just kidnapping these girls. They're running a systematic business operation with profit margins and delivery schedules. "Doc," Tom said quietly, pointing to a section of Mara's financial records. "Look at these payments. Regular deposits to accounts belonging to Sheriff Brady, Coleman Hayes, and Judge Blackthorne. This isn't just crime. This is organized conspiracy involving the most powerful men in the territory." Mara's pencil moved across another paper, this time drawing a map that extended far beyond Cedar Junction's boundaries. Trade routes connecting their town to mining camps, railroad construction sites, and frontier settlements hundreds of miles away. Each destination was marked with symbols indicating the type of merchandise most in demand at that location. "Sweet Jesus," Dr. Cross whispered, understanding dawning like a horrible sunrise. "It's not just local crime. They're part of a territorial network. Cedar Junction is a collection point feeding into a massive trafficking operation that spans the entire Western Territory." The doctor studied Mara's face with new respect and growing horror. "Child, How long have you been documenting all of this? Mara held up 3 fingers, then pointed to herself, then made writing motions in the air. 3 years of perfect photographic recall, 3 years of memorizing every detail of crimes that would destroy dozens of powerful men if her testimony ever reached the right authorities. Tom Marshall leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what Mara had revealed. We're not dealing with a few missing girls and some local corruption. We're looking at evidence that could bring down judges, sheriffs, businessmen, maybe even territorial officials. He looked at the maps scattered across Dr. Cross's office, each one representing months of careful observation and perfect memory. And this girl, this silent witness, has it all mapped out in her mind. Dr. Cross reached over and gently touched Mara's hand. You've been carrying this burden alone for 3 years, haven't you? Watching, remembering, documenting crimes that would break most people's sanity. Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, and for the first time since arriving in Cedar Junction, she spoke in clear, perfect English. 47 girls, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. 47 names, faces, stories. All here, she tapped her temple, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for justice, waiting for the world to know what happens to forgotten children in forgotten places. The silence that followed was profound and terrible, broken only by the sound of Dr. Cross's clock ticking away the seconds while 3 adults contemplated the magnitude of horrors that a 17-year-old girl had witnessed and perfectly preserved in her extraordinary memory. We're going to stop them, Tom said finally, his voice carrying the weight of an oath. Every last one of them. And your maps, your memory, your testimony is going to be the weapon that brings them down. Mara smiled for the first time in 3 years, and in that smile was the terrible beauty of justice delayed but not denied. The first time Mara discovered the tunnels, she was chasing a rat through the heating ducts above Judge Blackthorn's basement complex. Her small frame, weakened by months of minimal food, could navigate spaces that would trap a grown person, and her Apache training had taught her to move through confined spaces as silently as smoke. What she found in those hidden arteries beneath Cedar Junction changed everything she thought she knew about the scope of Blackthorn's operation. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the judge's wine cellar, sealed with a heavy stone door that required 2 men to move. Mara watched through an air vent as Sheriff Brady and Coleman Hayes rolled the massive barrier aside, revealing a brick-lined passage that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of their lanterns. The engineering was sophisticated, professional, built to last decades rather than months. Shipment ready for transport to St. Mary's, Sheriff Brady announced, consulting a clipboard like a railroad conductor checking schedules. Behind him, 3 girls stumbled forward in chains, their faces hollow with despair and malnutrition. Mara recognized 2 of them from earlier arrivals at the judge's basement, sisters from a farming family whose parents had defaulted on land payments. Coleman Hayes checked his pocket watch with the precision of a businessman coordinating multiple operations. Father McKenna's expecting them by midnight. His congregation has been asking too many questions about the sounds from the church basement, so we need to move them to the bank vault by tomorrow evening. The casual way he discussed human cargo like inventory made Mara's stomach churn with rage. Following the procession through the ventilation system above the tunnel, Mara mapped every twist and turn in her photographic memory. The passage branched in 3 directions, with carefully maintained wooden beams supporting the ceiling and drainage channels carved into the floor. This wasn't hasty construction. Someone had invested serious money and planning into creating a transportation network that could move people beneath the town without detection. The first branch led to St. Mary's Catholic Church, emerging through a concealed entrance beneath the altar where Father McKenna waited with another group of men Mara didn't recognize. Gentlemen from Denver, she heard the priest explain to Brady. Mining camp supervisors looking for domestic workers. They pay cash, no questions asked, and they understand discretion. His collar gleamed white in the lantern light, but his words carried the stench of corruption that turned holy places into market stalls. The second tunnel branch connected to Cedar Junction First National Bank, where President Harrison Vance had converted the basement vault into temporary holding cells with iron bars and minimal ventilation. Railroad buyers arrived Thursday, he told Hayes as they conducted their underground business meeting. Westward expansion crews need women for cooking, cleaning, camp services. They're not particular about documentation or family connections. But it was the third tunnel that shocked Mara most completely. The longest passage ran directly beneath Main Street to emerge in the basement of Mayor Patterson's residence, where the town's elected leader maintained his own collection of debt servants in chambers that rivaled Blackthorn's for sophisticated cruelty. Municipal contracts, she heard him explaining to visiting businessmen. Girls work off family obligations through civic service. Very profitable arrangement for all parties involved. From her hidden vantage point in the heating ducts, Mara witnessed the full scope of the operation over the following months. Girls arrived at Blackthorn's mansion through legitimate channels, debt collection, orphan placement, domestic service contracts, then disappeared into the underground network where they became invisible to the outside world. The tunnel system allowed their captors to move human cargo between 4 different locations without risking street-level detection. Each facility served a different function in the trafficking pipeline. Blackthorn's basement handled initial processing and documentation, creating fake work contracts and identification papers. The church basement served as a temporary way station where girls were prepared for transport, given basic medical care, and sorted according to buyer preferences. The bank vault provided secure storage for valuable merchandise awaiting shipment, while the mayor's residence functioned as a private collection for clients who preferred local arrangements. The engineering marvel beneath Cedar Junction represented years of planning and coordination between the town's most respected citizens. They'd created their own underground railroad, but instead of carrying people to freedom, it transported them deeper into slavery. The irony wasn't lost on Mara, whose own people had suffered similar transportation to reservations designed to erase their existence. Watching from above as another group of girls was herded through the tunnels like cattle being driven to slaughter, Mara began to understand the true genius of Blackthorn's operation. By involving the church, the bank, the mayor's office, and the sheriff's department, he'd made the entire town complicit in maintaining the cover-up. Citizens who might question one missing girl would never suspect that their most trusted institutions were collaborating to disappear dozens. The ventilation system that carried heat throughout the tunnel network also carried sound, and Mara learned to identify girls by their voices, their crying patterns, their prayers whispered in languages their captors couldn't understand. She mapped not just the physical layout of the underground complex, but the emotional geography of suffering that echoed through those brick corridors night after night. During her months of secret surveillance, Mara witnessed business meetings where buyer specifications were discussed like livestock breeding requirements. Young, strong, compliant, she heard repeatedly. No obvious injuries, good teeth, able to work long hours without supervision. The dehumanization was so complete that these men discussed teenage girls the same way they might negotiate the purchase of horses or cattle. The most horrifying discovery came when Mara realized the tunnel system extended beyond Cedar Junction's boundaries. Additional passages connected to abandoned mine shafts, old Indian burial caves, and hidden chambers that provided staging areas for territorial distribution. Their small town wasn't just participating in human trafficking, it was a major hub in a network that stretched across multiple states. From her hidden perch in the air ducts, Mara watched wagon loads of girls arrive through secret entrances, processed through the underground complex, then shipped out through different exits to destinations hundreds of miles away. The logistics required coordination between multiple towns, railway systems, mining operations, and frontier settlements. Blackthorn hadn't just created a local criminal enterprise. He'd built a corporation. As winter settled over Cedar Junction and the tunnel traffic increased to accommodate higher demand from mining camps preparing for spring operations, Mara made detailed mental maps of every passage, every hiding place, every weakness in their security system. She memorized schedules, guard rotations, supply deliveries, and communication protocols between the different facilities. The men who'd built this underground empire believed they were untouchable, protected by their positions of authority and their careful coordination. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed that a silent Indian girl was invisible, forgettable, incapable of understanding the significance of what she witnessed. They'd built their kingdom of horrors around a living witness who was recording every detail of their crimes with photographic precision. And someday, when the opportunity arose, Mara would use their own tunnel system against them, turning their carefully constructed transportation network into the pathway that would lead to their destruction. Dr. Cross's office had become a war room, papers covering every surface like evidence of an invisible battle fought in the shadows beneath their peaceful town. Mara knelt in the center of the organized chaos, her hands moving across fresh sheets of paper with the mechanical precision of someone who'd carried these images in her mind for far too long. When she began to speak, her voice carried the weight of 47 stories that demanded to be heard. Emily Watson, age 14, brown hair, green eyes, taken September 12, 1881. Mara's pencil moved as she spoke, creating a symbol that looked like a flower beside a series of numbers. Father owed money to Judge Blackthorne for land taxes. Family thought Emily was going to work as a domestic servant in Denver. She was sold to a traveling circus for $50. Last seen performing in a cage with wild animals for men who paid extra to watch her fear. Deputy Marshal and Dr. Cross exchanged horrified glances as they realized what they were witnessing. Mara wasn't just recalling information, she was providing detailed testimony that could convict dozens of men for crimes against humanity. Each symbol on her maps represented a destroyed life, a family torn apart, a girl who trusted the wrong people with her future. Martha Liu, age 16, Chinese, taken October 8, 1881. The next symbol resembled a broken wing. Parents killed in mining accident, Martha became ward of the territorial court. Judge assigned guardianship to Coleman Hayes, who claimed she needed specialized care only available in California. Sold to railroad construction crews for $100. Used as entertainment for workers building the Western Expansion Line. Tom felt his throat tighten as the pattern became clear. Blackthorne and his associates had systematically targeted the most vulnerable families in their jurisdiction, immigrants, debtors, orphans, anyone without powerful connections to investigate their disappearances. They'd used their official positions to create legal justifications for separating girls from their families, then sold them into situations that guaranteed they'd never return home. Sarah Chen, Mara's voice cracked slightly as she drew a symbol that looked like a bird trapped in a cage. My friend. 16 years old, gentle hands, sang Chinese lullabies when other girls cried at night. Father's gambling debt used as excuse to take her. Sold to frontier brothel in Colorado mining camp. Letters she wrote begging for help were burned without being sent. Dr. Cross wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Mara create an entire registry of the disappeared, each entry more heartbreaking than the last. The medical precision of her memory extended to emotional details that painted vivid pictures of girls who'd been reduced to transaction records in Blackthorne's ledgers. But some of them, Mara continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation, some of them fought back. Or tried to escape. Or became too sick to be profitable. Her pencil began drawing different symbols now, darker marks that carried ominous meaning. These symbols marked the ones who never left Cedar Junction. Tom leaned forward, dreading what he was about to learn. What happened to them? Rebecca Morrison, age 15, blacksmith's daughter. Mara's symbol this time was a cross marking what was clearly meant to represent a grave. Caught trying to escape through the bank tunnel. Sheriff Brady said she fell and hit her head, but I heard her screaming for help before the sound stopped forever. Buried in unmarked grave behind the church. The deputy's hands clenched into fists as he realized they weren't just dealing with human trafficking. They were looking at evidence of systematic murder used to maintain discipline and secrecy within the operation. Anna Kowalski, age 17, Polish family. Another grave symbol. Became pregnant during captivity. Blackthorne said damaged merchandise couldn't be sold, so she needed to be disposed of quietly. Made to look like she drowned in a creek during a washing accident. Dr. Cross felt bile rise in her throat as the full scope of the atrocities became clear. These men hadn't just been selling girls, they'd been executing anyone who threatened their operation's security or profitability. Mara continued her terrible catalogue, each name accompanied by meticulous details that only someone who'd witnessed every moment could provide. She described the buyers who'd purchased specific girls, their destinations. Their fates at the hands of men who viewed human beings as disposable commodities. Her photographic memory had preserved evidence that would hang every person involved in the conspiracy. 17 graves, she said finally, marking the last burial symbol on her map. 17 girls who died rather than submit, or who became inconvenient for business reasons. All buried in secret locations around Cedar Junction, their families told they'd run away or move to distant cities for better opportunities. The silence that followed was profound and devastating. Tom Marshall stared at the maps scattered around them, trying to process the magnitude of crimes that had been committed in his jurisdiction while he'd been investigating cattle theft and bar fights. 17 murders, 30 other girls sold into slavery, and a conspiracy involving every major authority figure in their community. There's more, Mara said quietly, reaching for another piece of paper. The buyers, the destinations, the shipping schedules. Everything is connected to a network that reaches into 5 territories. Cedar Junction is just one collection point in an operation that moves hundreds of girls every year. Her newest drawing showed trade routes extending across the Western Territories, with symbols indicating different types of buyers at various destinations. Mining camps, railroad construction sites, frontier towns, even some respectable cities back east where wealthy men paid premium prices for exotic merchandise that couldn't be traced back to its origins. Judge Blackthorne keeps detailed records, Mara continued, her voice gaining strength with each revelation. Not just local transactions, but territorial partnerships with judges, sheriffs, politicians, businessmen in dozens of other towns. He's not just a criminal, he's the territorial coordinator for systematic human trafficking on a scale that would shock the federal government. Dr. Cross stood up and began pacing, her medical mind struggling to comprehend the systematic nature of the atrocities. Child, you've witnessed crimes that constitute treason against basic human decency. The evidence you're providing could dismantle criminal networks across multiple states. Tom Marshall studied the grave symbols scattered across Mara's maps, thinking about the families who'd spent years wondering what happened to daughters who'd simply vanished. We need federal authorities, he said grimly. This is beyond anything local law enforcement can handle, especially since half the local authorities are involved in the conspiracy. Mara looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much but still burned with determination for justice. The Federal Marshal Station in Denver, she said clearly. Telegraph sent 3 weeks ago requesting investigation into missing persons reports from Cedar Junction area. Response scheduled to arrive next Monday with 2 deputy marshals and territorial prosecutor. Both adults stared at her in amazement. How do you know that? Dr. Cross asked. I read Sheriff Brady's correspondence when I clean his office, Mara replied matter-of-factly. He doesn't know federal authorities are already suspicious about disappearance patterns in this jurisdiction. Blackthorne and his partners think they have more time to cover their tracks. Tom felt a grim smile cross his face as he realized what Mara was telling them. They're not expecting trouble until Monday, which gives us 4 days to gather evidence and protect witnesses before the cavalry arrives. 4 days, Mara agreed, to make sure the federal marshals find enough evidence to hang everyone involved in murdering 47 innocent girls. Her voice carried the weight of sacred vow as she added, for days to make sure every name I've memorized gets the justice they died waiting for. The keeper of names had finally found people willing to listen, and her perfect memory was about to become the weapon that would destroy the men who thought silence could be bought with fear and maintained through murder. Judge Cornelius Blackthorne's carriage rolled into Cedar Junction at sunset on Thursday, dust rising from the wheels like smoke from a funeral pyre. He'd been in the territorial capital for 2 weeks, attending court sessions and, more importantly, meeting with political backers who were growing impatient about their investment in his gubernatorial campaign. The smile on his weathered face spoke of successful negotiations and promising developments, but it faded the moment he saw Sheriff Brady's panicked expression waiting on his mansion's front steps. "We have a problem," Brady said without preamble, his usual composure cracked like a dam about to burst. "The girl, Mara, she's gone missing. Been gone 3 days, and there's talk she's been drawing pictures around town. Detailed pictures." Blackthorne's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He dismounted slowly, his mind already calculating the catastrophic implications of Mara's disappearance. "What kind of pictures?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would destroy everything he'd built over the past 5 years. "Maps," Brady whispered, glancing around nervously even though they were alone. "Architectural drawings of buildings, including." He swallowed hard. "Including your basement complex. Tom Marshall's been asking questions, and Dr. Cross has been seen with papers that look like blueprints." The judge's carefully maintained facade of respectability crumbled like a house built on sand. For 3 years, he'd kept Mara as insurance, believing her traumatized silence guaranteed his secrets would die with her if necessary. He'd never suspected that her perfect memory was cataloging every detail of his operation with photographic precision. "Get Hayes and meet me in the wine cellar," Blackthorne commanded, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "Bring the emergency protocols and the elimination lists we prepared for federal investigations." He paused, studying Brady's frightened face. "How much does Marshall know?" "Enough to be dangerous," Brady admitted. "He's been asking about tunnel construction permits, basement excavations, missing persons reports from surrounding counties. If that girl's been talking." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung between them like a death warrant. Within an hour, the 3 architects of Cedar Junction's underground empire gathered in the hidden chamber beneath Blackthorne's wine cellar. Coleman Hayes spread architectural drawings across the wooden table, pointing to escape routes and evidence destruction protocols they'd hoped never to need. But the judge's attention was focused on a different set of documents, campaign finance records that told a story of systematic criminal enterprise funding political ambitions. "Gentlemen," Blackthorne began, his voice steady despite the crisis threatening to destroy them all, "we're not just facing exposure of our local operations. We're looking at federal investigations that could uncover the true scope of our territorial network." He gestured to the financial ledgers spread across the table. $73,000 in campaign contributions generated through strategic merchandise sales over the past 3 years. Hayes felt his stomach clench as he realized the judge was revealing information they'd never been told. "You've been using trafficking profits to fund your political career." "I've been using available resources to secure political power that will protect our operations permanently," Blackthorne corrected coldly. "Territorial governor means federal law enforcement coordination, judicial appointments, resource allocation for entire region. One successful campaign, and we control law enforcement from Denver to California." Brady stared at the financial records with growing horror. "You mean this whole operation, everything we've done, was about buying you a governor's office?" "Everything we've done has been about building sustainable power," Blackthorne snapped. "Local corruption is temporary, vulnerable to exposure and investigation. But territorial political control creates permanent protection for our enterprise." He pulled out correspondence from his political backers, letters that revealed the scope of his ambitions. Railroad companies, mining consortiums. territorial development corporations, they all need reliable supplies of disposable labor. Governor Blackthorne would ensure those needs are met through official channels. The implications hit his partners like physical blows. They weren't just accomplices to human trafficking, they were funding a political campaign designed to institutionalize slavery across the entire Western Territory. Blackthorne's gubernatorial platform would create legal frameworks for forced labor, debt peonage, and systematic exploitation disguised as economic development policy. The federal marshals arriving Monday, Hayes said slowly, understanding dawning like a horrible sunrise. They're not just investigating missing persons. They're investigating campaign finance irregularities that led them to our operations. Blackthorne nodded grimly. Political opponents have been asking uncomfortable questions about my funding sources. Federal authorities started tracing large cash deposits to my campaign accounts, which led them to examine economic activities in my jurisdiction. He gestured toward the tunnel entrance. They're not coming to investigate 17 missing girls. They're coming to investigate treasonous conspiracy to subvert territorial government. The silence that followed was thick with desperation and growing panic. Brady and Hayes realized they weren't just facing arrest for local crimes, they were looking at federal charges for conspiracy against the United States government. Political corruption, systematic slavery, and campaign finance violations that could result in execution for treason. The emergency protocols, Brady said urgently. We eliminate all evidence, silence all witnesses, and disappear before Monday. Not all evidence, Blackthorne corrected, consulting a prepared list of names and addresses. Some evidence needs to point investigators toward convenient scapegoats who can't testify in their own defense. His finger traced down the list, stopping at familiar names. Marshall, Dr. Cross, and anyone else who's seen Mara's drawings become liabilities that must be resolved permanently. Hayes felt his mouth go dry. You're talking about murdering federal law enforcement. I'm talking about protecting a political movement that will reshape territorial governance for the next generation, Blackthorne replied calmly. Governor Blackthorne will implement policies that make our current operations look like charitable work compared to what becomes legally permissible under territorial statutes. The judge stood and moved to a hidden wall safe, removing documents that revealed the true scope of his political conspiracy. Campaign correspondence from judges, sheriffs, businessmen, and politicians across multiple territories, all coordinating to create systematic frameworks for legal exploitation of vulnerable populations. Gentlemen, we're not just running a criminal enterprise, he announced, spreading the letters across the table. We're launching a political revolution that will institutionalize our methods across the entire Western expansion. Monday's federal investigation threatens to destroy 5 years of careful political positioning that could have generated millions in revenue and unprecedented power. Brady and Hayes stared at the correspondence, realizing they'd been unwitting participants in a conspiracy that extended far beyond local corruption. Blackthorne hadn't just been building a trafficking network, he'd been creating the political infrastructure to make systematic slavery legal again under territorial law. The elimination protocols begin tonight, Blackthorne commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to ordering executions. Marshall, Dr. Cross, and the girl must be silenced before they can provide testimony to federal authorities. We have less than 4 days to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, and implement our emergency evacuation to Mexico. As thunder rumbled overhead and the first drops of rain began falling on Cedar Junction, the 3 men who'd built their empire on the suffering of 47 innocent girls began planning the murders that would either secure their escape or guarantee their destruction. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. Mara's perfect memory hadn't just recorded their crimes, she'd anticipated their desperation and planned accordingly. The judge's return marked the beginning of the end, but not in the way any of them expected. The Keeper of Names was ready for war, and her weapons were truth, memory, and the righteous fury of someone who'd watched evil prosper too long in darkness. The sound of breaking glass echoed through Dr. Cross's office as Brady's men smashed through the front windows, their faces twisted with the desperate violence of cornered animals. But the medical office was empty except for scattered papers and the lingering scent of fear. Mara had led Deputy Marshal and Dr. Cross into the tunnel system through a hidden entrance beneath the church 20 minutes earlier, disappearing into the underground labyrinth she knew better than anyone alive. There in the tunnels, Sheriff Brady snarled to his hunting party of 6 armed men. The girls leading them straight to evidence that'll hang us all. He kicked over Dr. Cross's examination table in frustration, sending medical instruments clattering across the floor. Split up. Cover every entrance. And remember, no witnesses walk out of those tunnels alive. 3 levels beneath Cedar Junction's peaceful streets, Mara moved through the darkness with the silent confidence of someone who'd spent 3 years memorizing every pipe, every support beam, every hidden passage in Blackthorn's underground empire. Behind her, Deputy Marshal and Dr. Cross struggled to keep pace, their breathing echoing loudly in the confined space despite their efforts at stealth. "This way," Mara whispered, leading them through a narrow maintenance shaft that connected the church basement to the judge's wine cellar. Blackthorn keeps the real records in a hidden safe behind the false wall. Financial ledgers, buyer contracts, shipping schedules, everything. Her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty that came from 3 years of careful observation. The shaft opened into the wine cellar that Marshall had visited dozens of times as an invited guest, never suspecting the horror hidden behind the innocent-looking stone wall. Mara's small hands found the concealed mechanism with practiced ease, and the heavy barrier swung aside to reveal Blackthorn's private office, a chamber that contained the administrative heart of systematic evil. Dr. Cross gasped as her lantern illuminated the room's contents. Leather ledgers lined wooden shelves from floor to ceiling, each volume meticulously organized by year, buyer category, and merchandise specifications. A large desk dominated the center space, covered with correspondence that revealed the territorial scope of Blackthorn's operations. But it was the wall of photographs that made Marshall's blood run cold. Dozens of portrait photographs arranged in neat rows, each image showing a girl between the ages of 12 and 18. Beneath each photograph, detailed information written in Blackthorn's careful script: name, age, family background, physical specifications, purchase price, and final destination. It was a catalog of human merchandise that reduced 47 individual tragedies to business records. "Sweet Jesus," Dr. Cross whispered, studying the systematic documentation of crimes against humanity. He kept records of everything, like some kind of perverted business ledger. Her hands trembled as she opened one of the volumes, revealing pages of financial calculations that treated human suffering as profit margins. Mara moved to the desk and began pulling documents from hidden compartments with the efficiency of someone who'd watched Blackthorn organize his files countless times. "Campaign finance records," she explained, spreading papers across the surface. "Every trafficking sale includes contributions to his gubernatorial campaign fund. He's been selling girls to buy political power." Marshall studied the financial documents, his law enforcement training helping him understand the scope of the conspiracy. "This isn't just local crime. He's been coordinating with buyers across 5 territories. Using trafficking profits to fund political campaigns that would make these operations legal." The deputy's voice cracked with rage as the implications became clear. "There's more," Mara said quietly, leading them to a second hidden chamber behind the office. The disposal room. Where Blackthorn keeps evidence of girls who couldn't be sold or became too dangerous to keep alive. She pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing a space that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. The chamber contained 17 small wooden coffins arranged against the walls like macabre filing cabinets. Each coffin bore a brass nameplate with dates of arrival and death, creating a memorial to young women who died fighting for their freedom or simply because they'd become inconvenient for business operations. Dr. Cross opened the nearest coffin with shaking hands, her medical training overcoming her revulsion as she examined the contents. Rebecca Morrison, she read from the nameplate. Cause of death listed as accidental fall, but these bone fractures indicate systematic beating. Her voice was clinical, professional, but tears streamed down her cheeks as she documented evidence of murder. Marshall moved to examine other coffins, his heart hammering as he read the names of girls who'd been declared missing or runaway by official investigations. Each coffin contained physical evidence that contradicted the stories their families had been told about voluntary departures or accidental deaths. Anna Kowalski, alleged drowning victim, he said, studying skull fractures that suggested blunt force trauma. Maria Santos, supposedly died of illness, but these marks indicate strangulation. The deputy's voice grew darker with each examination as he realized how many murders had been covered up by false death certificates and manipulated investigations. Mara stood before the 17th coffin, her face pale but determined. "This one is different," she said quietly. Sarah Marshall. Blackthorne told everyone she ran away with a traveling merchant, but she never left Cedar Junction. "She's been here for 8 months. The name hit Marshall like a physical blow, and he stumbled backward as the horrible truth crashed over him. Sarah Marshall. My sister Sarah. His voice broke as he approached the coffin with trembling hands. She didn't run away. She was murdered, and I've been investigating her disappearance for 8 months while her killer invited me to dinner parties. Dr. Cross touched his shoulder gently as Marshall opened his sister's coffin, revealing the remains that confirmed his worst fears. Tom, I'm so sorry. But now we know the truth, and we can make sure she gets justice. Justice, Marshall repeated, his grief transforming into cold fury. Blackthorne has been playing with me for months, pretending to help search for Sarah while she was buried in his basement. Every conversation, every dinner invitation, every expression of sympathy was part of his entertainment. The sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel system interrupted their investigation. Brady's hunting party was getting closer, and their voices carried the urgency of men who knew they were running out of time to silence witnesses. We need to move, Mara urged, gathering the most damaging documents and stuffing them into a leather satchel. There's another way out through the bank tunnel, but we have to reach it before they block all the exits. She looked at Marshall, noting the dangerous gleam in his eyes. Your sister's death won't be meaningless if we can get this evidence to the federal marshals. Marshall took one last look at Sarah's coffin, then helped Dr. Cross gather medical evidence from the other remains. 17 girls, 47 total victims, and a political conspiracy that reaches across multiple territories, he said grimly. We're not just carrying evidence of local crimes. We're carrying proof of systematic treason against the United States government. As they prepared to leave the Chamber of Horrors, the sound of Brady's voice echoed from the main tunnel, closer now and filled with desperate urgency. Find them. If they reach the federal marshals with that evidence, we're all dead men. Mara extinguished their lantern and led them into the darkness, moving through passages that would either deliver them to safety or become their tomb. Behind them, the hunting party closed in with the viciousness of men who had nothing left to lose and everything to hide. The race between justice and murder was about to reach its climax in the underground arteries beneath Cedar Junction, where the Keeper of Names would either fulfill her sacred duty or join the 17 victims whose stories she'd promised to tell. The tunnel junction beneath Main Street became a deadly chess game as Mara positioned Marshall and Dr. Cross at the bank entrance while she doubled back through passages that would put her behind Blackthorne's hunting party. Her small frame allowed her to navigate maintenance shafts too narrow for grown men, giving her tactical advantages the judge's associates had never considered when they built their underground empire around a silent witness they'd underestimated. She's leading us in circles, Brady snarled as his men stumbled through the darkness, their lanterns casting dancing shadows that made every turn seem like a trap. That girl knows these tunnels better than we do, and she's making us look like fools. His voice echoed with the desperation of a man who could hear federal justice approaching like thunder from the eastern horizon. From her hidden position in an air duct above the main passage, Mara watched the hunting party spread out in frustration, searching for tracks that would never be found in the carefully maintained tunnels. She'd spent 3 years studying their movements, learning their patterns, memorizing their weaknesses. Now she was ready to turn their own underground prison against them. Using a system of rope and pulleys she'd installed during months of secret preparation, Mara began collapsing specific tunnel sections behind Blackthorn's men, cutting off their escape routes while herding them toward the central chamber where the judge waited with Coleman Hayes and 2 surviving girls who'd been kept as emergency insurance against exactly this situation. "Gentlemen," Blackthorn's voice carried clearly through the tunnel network as he realized his men were being systematically trapped by someone who understood the underground complex better than its creators. "It appears our silent witness has been less passive than we assumed. But I still hold cards that will guarantee our safe passage from this jurisdiction." Mara crept through the ventilation system until she could see into the central chamber, where Blackthorn stood beside 2 terrified girls chained to support posts, Lucy Morrison and Elena Santos, supposedly dead for months but kept alive as leverage for emergencies. The judge's expensive suit was dirty now, his silver hair disheveled, but his cold eyes still burned with the arrogance of a man accustomed to absolute control. "Mara Blackwood," the judge called out, knowing she was listening even though he couldn't see her. "I know you can hear me, you clever little savage. 3 years of pretending to be mute, 3 years of watching and waiting and planning. Quite impressive for someone we assumed was broken by trauma." His laughter echoed through the stone corridors like a death rattle. From her hiding place, Mara made a decision that would either save the hostages or get them all killed. She dropped silently into the chamber behind Blackthorn, her voice carrying clearly for the first time since her arrival in Cedar Junction 3 years earlier. "Actually, Judge Blackthorn," she said in perfect, unaccented English, "I wasn't broken by trauma. I was gathering evidence." The shock on his face was worth 3 years of careful deception as he spun around to stare at the girl who just revealed herself as something far more dangerous than a damaged witness. Blackthorn's hand moved to his coat pocket, but Mara was already speaking with the confident authority of someone who'd planned this confrontation down to the smallest detail. "The rope you're reaching for won't help you. I cut it an hour ago. The gun in your left pocket has no ammunition. I removed the bullets yesterday while you were meeting with your campaign backers. And the escape route through the wine cellar has been sealed from the outside." The judge's face went white as he realized the scope of her preparation. "You're not mute. You never were mute. You've been planning this for 3 years." His voice cracked with the understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd considered property. "Planning, preparing, documenting, and most importantly, communicating," Mara confirmed, her voice steady despite the danger. "Did you really think I spent 3 years in your basement without making contact with the outside world? Federal authorities have been receiving detailed reports about your operation for 18 months. Marshal Davidson's early arrival yesterday wasn't coincidental." Brady's voice echoed from the collapsed tunnel behind them as he realized they were trapped. "Boss. The passages are blocked. We can't get out." His panic was audible even through the stone walls, and Blackthorn's expression shifted from shock to desperate rage. "You little bitch," he snarled, pulling a knife from his boot. "Even if you've contacted federal authorities, these girls die before I let them testify against me." The blade moved toward Lucy's throat, but Mara's voice stopped him cold. "Judge Cornelius Blackthorn, you are under arrest for conspiracy, human trafficking, murder, and treason against the United States government." The voice came from the tunnel entrance, where Marshal Davidson stood with 4 federal deputies, their weapons trained on the man who'd built his political career on the suffering of 47 innocent girls. Blackthorn spun toward the federal officers, his knife still pressed against Lucy's neck. "You're too late, Marshal. These witnesses die before they testify, and without their testimony, you have nothing but the fantasies of a traumatized Indian girl. Actually, Marshall Davidson replied calmly, we have detailed financial records, shipping schedules, buyer contracts, correspondence with territorial officials, and testimony from 6 surviving victims who've been cooperating with our investigation for the past 4 months. He gestured toward Mara. Miss Ayanna here has been our primary informant since she made contact with our Denver office through the Apache Reservation's federal liaison. The revelation hit Blackthorn like a physical blow. Mara hadn't just been gathering evidence, she'd been coordinating with federal authorities to build an airtight case that would dismantle his entire network. Her 3 years of silence hadn't been trauma. It had been strategy. My real name is Ayanna, Mara continued, speaking directly to Blackthorn for the first time without fear. It means, eternal blossom, in my father's language. My father was Joseph Ayanna, the Apache tracker whose memory skills you wanted for your own purposes. But you never understood that those skills included the ability to communicate with federal authorities through coded messages hidden in routine supply deliveries to the reservation. Marshall Davidson moved closer, his deputies spreading out to cover all possible escape routes. Every letter she sent through the reservation supply network reached our office with detailed intelligence about your operation. Financial records, victim identifications, buyer networks, political conspiracies, we've had enough evidence to hang you for 6 months. Blackthorn's hand trembled as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. The silent witness he'd kept as insurance had actually been a federal informant gathering evidence that would destroy not just his local operation, but his entire territorial political network. Why wait? If you had evidence months ago, why let more girls suffer? Because we needed to identify the complete network, Marshall Davidson explained. Your operation connected to trafficking rings in 5 territories. Taking you down prematurely would have warned other cells and allowed hundreds of criminals to escape justice. We needed every name, every location, every participant identified before we could act. Ayanna looked directly into Blackthorn's eyes, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived hell to deliver justice. 47 girls suffered and died to build the evidence that will hang you and everyone like you. Their sacrifice will save thousands of other children from sharing their fate. As federal deputies moved in to arrest the man who thought himself untouchable, Ayanna began untying Lucy and Elena, speaking to them in gentle tones that promised their nightmare was finally ending. The Keeper of Names had fulfilled her sacred duty, and the underground empire built on suffering was about to collapse under the weight of perfect memory and carefully planned justice. Blackthorn's last words as the handcuffs closed around his wrists were a whispered acknowledgement of his complete defeat. You were never broken at all, were you? Ayanna's smile was sharp as justice itself. No, Judge. I was never broken. I was just getting ready to break you. The territorial courthouse in Denver had never seen anything like the evidence spread across 3 massive tables in the federal prosecutor's conference room. Ayanna's maps covered every surface, each drawing more detailed than architectural blueprints, each symbol representing crimes that would shock the entire Western Territory. Federal Marshal Davidson stood before a room packed with prosecutors, judges, and territorial officials, pointing to documentation that would reshape how law enforcement approached organized crime. Ladies and gentlemen, Davidson announced, his voice carrying the weight of historic justice, what you're seeing represents the most comprehensive criminal investigation in territorial history. Every drawing, every map, every symbol was created from perfect photographic memory by a 17-year-old Apache girl who spent 3 years documenting systematic atrocities committed by men we trusted to uphold the law. Territorial Prosecutor Helena Morrison studied Ayanna's financial records with growing amazement. These profit calculations, the shipping schedules, the buyer specifications, this level of detail could only come from someone with access to the most confidential aspects of their operation. She looked up at Ayanna, who sat calmly at the witness table despite being surrounded by more authority figures than most people saw in a lifetime. Miss Ayanna, How were you able to remember such precise information over 3 years? Ayanna stood, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the assembled officials. My father, Joseph Ayanna, was one of the last traditional memory keepers among our people. Before the white man's schools, before written records, Apache elders preserved our history, our laws, our sacred knowledge through trained memory that could hold entire libraries without losing a single detail. She gestured toward her maps. He began training me when I was 7 years old, teaching me to see, remember, and reproduce everything I witnessed with perfect accuracy. The prosecutor leaned forward, fascinated by this revelation. You're saying this is a traditional Apache skill passed down through generations? Memory mapping, Ayanna confirmed, moving to stand beside her architectural drawings. Warriors used it to navigate vast territories, remember water sources, track enemy movements, preserve battle strategies. Elders used it to maintain oral histories spanning centuries. My father taught me these techniques, but he also taught me something more specific. Her voice grew somber. He taught me survival memory, how to document evidence of crimes against our people that could be used for justice if I ever lived long enough to testify. Marshal Davidson felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications. Your father knew you might be captured. He prepared you specifically to be a witness. Ayanna nodded, her dark eyes reflecting pain and determination. After the Sand Creek Massacre, after Wounded Knee, after countless raids where Apache children disappeared into white captivity, my father realized someone needed to survive who could bear witness to systematic crimes against our people. He trained me not just to remember, but to remember with legal precision that would hold up in white man's courts. She moved to a map showing trafficking routes across 5 territories, pointing to symbols that represented distribution networks spanning thousands of miles. Every detail was chosen deliberately to provide evidence that would meet federal prosecution standards. Names, dates, financial records, physical descriptions, transportation methods, everything documented with the precision needed to convict criminals in American legal systems. Federal Judge Harrison Wells examined the shipping schedules with growing horror. Miss Ayanna, are you telling us that your people have developed memory techniques specifically to gather evidence against crimes committed by white authorities? Not just white authorities, Ayanna replied diplomatically. Any authorities who commit systematic crimes against vulnerable populations. Memory keepers among many tribes have preserved evidence of massacres, forced relocations, treaty violations, systematic abuses that would otherwise be forgotten or denied by official histories. She gestured toward Blackthorn's correspondence. My father taught me that truth preserved in trained memory is more powerful than lies written on paper, because memory cannot be burned, stolen, or altered by those who wish to hide their crimes. Prosecutor Morrison spread out the buyer contracts and campaign finance records, studying the scope of corruption Ayanna had documented. The political conspiracy alone involves judges, sheriffs, and businessmen across multiple territories. Without your testimony, most of these criminals would have escaped justice entirely. That was the plan, Ayanna said simply. Blackthorn believed traumatized Indian children make perfect witnesses because we're considered unreliable, uneducated, incapable of understanding complex legal matters. He never suspected that my silence was strategic, that my presence in his basement was actually federal intelligence gathering conducted through traditional Apache surveillance methods. The revelation sent murmurs through the packed room as territorial officials realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in American legal history. A Native American girl had used traditional tribal skills to conduct the most sophisticated criminal investigation their courts had ever seen, gathering evidence that would convict dozens of powerful white men for crimes against humanity. Marshal Davidson consulted his case files, reading from testimonies gathered across multiple states. Based on Miss Ayanna's intelligence, we've arrested 43 individuals involved in human trafficking operations. We've rescued 32 surviving victims from locations in Colorado, Nevada, California, and New Mexico. We've seized financial assets totaling over $200,000 in campaign funds generated through trafficking profits. And the executions? Judge Wells asked grimly. Scheduled for next month, Davidson replied. Judge Blackthorne, Sheriff Brady, Coleman Hayes, and 6 territorial accomplices will hang for treason, murder, and crimes against humanity. Their political network has been completely dismantled, and federal oversight will prevent similar operations from developing in future territorial expansion. Ayanna looked around the room at faces that reflected shock, admiration, and a growing understanding of what her testimony represented. My father told me that if I ever survived captivity, I had a sacred duty to speak for those who could not speak for themselves. 47 girls died in Blackthorne's operation. Their names, their stories, their suffering are preserved in my memory with perfect accuracy. Today, their voices are finally being heard. Prosecutor Morrison stood and addressed the assembled officials with the solemnity of someone making legal history. The territorial government will establish new protocols for investigating missing persons reports, particularly those involving Native American and immigrant populations. Federal oversight will monitor local authorities for systematic corruption. And Miss Ayanna's testimony will be preserved as evidence for future prosecutions of similar criminal networks. As the formal proceedings concluded and officials filed out to implement the most comprehensive legal reforms in territorial history, Ayanna remained at the witness table, surrounded by maps that had transformed her from victim to prosecutor, from silent witness to powerful voice for justice. She thought of her father, of the traditional training that had enabled her to survive and triumph over men who'd considered her disposable. Marshal Davidson approached her as the room emptied. Miss Ayanna, what will you do now? Where will you go? She smiled, gathering her maps with the careful precision she'd learned from 3 years of hiding evidence from monsters. I'm going home, Marshal. Back to my people, back to the reservation, where I'll train other young women in the memory-keeping skills that helped me survive. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd fulfilled a sacred mission. And if other criminals like Blackthorne emerge, if other children disappear into systems designed to erase them, there will be witnesses ready to remember everything and bring justice when the time comes. The keeper of names had become the teacher of justice, and her father's traditional wisdom had helped deliver the most significant victory against systematic oppression in territorial history. 6 months after the trial, the scaffold stood in Denver's Courthouse Square under a gray October sky, witnessed by hundreds of citizens who traveled from across the territory to see justice finally served. Judge Cornelius Blackthorne walked to his execution with the same arrogant dignity he'd maintained throughout his trial, but his eyes found Ayanna in the crowd, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw real fear in his expression. Any last words? The federal marshal asked, adjusting the noose with professional efficiency. Blackthorne's gaze never left Ayanna's face as he spoke his final statement to the crowd. I underestimated the memory of one Apache girl. That mistake destroyed an empire that could have reshaped territorial governance for generations. His voice carried no remorse, only the bitter acknowledgement of a master strategist who'd been outmaneuvered by an opponent he'd never taken seriously. Ayanna watched without emotion as the trapdoor opened and Cornelius Blackthorne paid the ultimate price for 47 murders and systematic crimes against humanity. But her satisfaction came not from his death, but from the knowledge that his execution marked the end of the largest human trafficking prosecution in American history. Present day, Federal Marshal Office, Denver. The war room that had once displayed Blackthorne's evidence now served as headquarters for the Territorial Anti-Trafficking Task Force, with Ayanna's maps covering 3 walls like battle plans for an ongoing campaign against organized crime. At 18 years old, she'd become the federal government's most valuable consultant for identifying and dismantling criminal networks that preyed on vulnerable populations across the expanding western frontier. Miss Ayanna, Marshal Davidson said, spreading new intelligence reports across the conference table, we've received concerning information from the Arizona Territory. 12 Navajo girls have disappeared from reservation schools over the past 6 months, and the patterns match trafficking operations we've seen before. He pointed to locations marked on territorial maps. We need your expertise to identify the network structure. Ayanna studied the reports with the analytical precision that had made her legendary among federal law enforcement. Her photographic memory had been trained on dozens of similar cases since Blackthorn's execution, and she could recognize trafficking patterns the way her father had once tracked game across vast wilderness. Boarding school administrators selling students to buyers who request specific tribal affiliations, she said, noting familiar elements. Transportation through mining camps to avoid main travel routes. Financial structures hidden within educational funding accounts. She moved to a large sheet of paper and began drawing with the same meticulous accuracy that had mapped Blackthorn's underground empire. Within minutes, a comprehensive organizational chart appeared, showing connections between Arizona school officials, Colorado mining supervisors, and California buyers that painted a clear picture of systematic kidnapping disguised as educational placement. The network is smaller but more sophisticated than Blackthorn's operation, Ayanna concluded, adding symbols that represented individual victims and their likely destinations. They're targeting Native children specifically because disappearances from reservations receive less federal attention than missing white children from established communities. Marshall Davidson studied her analysis with growing amazement, as he had dozens of times over the past months. How do you see these patterns so clearly? Other investigators need weeks to identify connections that you recognize immediately. Traditional memory training includes pattern recognition that goes beyond individual details, Ayanna explained, continuing to add elements to her organizational chart. My father taught me to see relationships, connections, systematic behaviors that repeat across different criminal operations. Each trafficking network follows predictable structures because human greed and cruelty operate according to certain principles. She finished her drawing and stepped back, revealing a complete blueprint for dismantling the Arizona operation. Arrest the school superintendent first. His financial records will lead to transportation coordinators. Raid the mining camps simultaneously to prevent evidence destruction. The buyers in California will surrender when they realize their supply chain has been compromised. 3 weeks later, federal raids based on Ayanna's analysis resulted in 37 arrests and the rescue of 11 surviving girls who'd been held in conditions that would have been familiar to anyone who'd experienced Blackthorn's basement chambers. But Ayanna's greatest satisfaction came from what happened after the rescues. Apache Reservation, Memory Keeper Training School. The small wooden building outside the reservation's main settlement had become famous throughout the territory as the place where traumatized children learned to transform their suffering into weapons of justice. Ayanna stood before 12 young women, ages 14 to 19, all survivors of trafficking operations who'd been rescued through federal investigations guided by her memory mapping techniques. Memory is power, she told them, using the same words her father had spoken to her years earlier. The men who hurt you believed your silence meant weakness. They thought trauma would make you unreliable witnesses. But traditional Apache memory training can turn your experiences into evidence that will convict criminals and save other children from sharing your suffering. Elena Santos, rescued from Blackthorn's tunnels 8 months earlier, raised her hand. What if we can't remember everything clearly? What if the trauma makes our memories unclear? Trauma memory and trained memory are different skills, Ayanna replied, moving to a large drawing board covered with organizational charts. Trauma memory preserves emotional experiences but may be fragmented or unclear. Trained memory preserves factual evidence with legal precision, regardless of emotional state during the original experience. She demonstrated by recreating a perfect map of Blackthorn's underground complex from memory, every detail exact despite the horrific nature of what it represented. The traditional Apache techniques I'm teaching you will enable your minds to preserve evidence that can convict criminals in federal courts, she continued. Names, dates, locations, financial transactions, transportation methods, buyer specifications, everything documented with the accuracy needed to destroy entire criminal networks. Maria Lopez, rescued from a Colorado mining operation 2 months earlier, studied Ayana's drawings with growing understanding. "You're teaching us to become federal informants using tribal memory skills." "I'm teaching you to become justice keepers," Ayana corrected gently. "Women who can survive the worst experiences and preserve evidence that will protect future generations from sharing your fate." She gestured toward testimonies from recent cases covering the walls. "Every criminal network we've dismantled, every trafficking operation we've destroyed, every victim we've rescued has been possible because survivors learned to transform their memories into weapons of liberation." Over the following months, Ayana's students became legendary among federal law enforcement as the most effective intelligence gatherers in the territory. Their traditional memory training, combined with their first-hand knowledge of trafficking operations, enabled them to identify criminal patterns and provide testimony that resulted in dozens of convictions. 1 year later, the small cemetery behind St. Mary's Church in Cedar Junction had been transformed from a place of hidden graves into a memorial garden where 17 marble headstones bore the names of girls who died fighting for their freedom. Ayana knelt beside Sarah Marshall's grave, placing wild flowers while Deputy Marshall, now Sheriff Marshall, stood quietly nearby. "The federal task force has identified and dismantled 12 trafficking networks across 6 territories," she reported to Sarah's memory. 43 surviving victims have been rescued and returned to their families. 137 criminals have been convicted based on evidence gathered using traditional Apache memory techniques. Sheriff Marshall looked out over the peaceful memorial garden, thinking about how completely their world had changed since that Tuesday morning when he'd noticed a girl drawing maps in the dirt. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished, Ayana. You've turned his traditional training into a weapon that's reshaping law enforcement across the entire western frontier." Ayana stood, brushing dirt from her hands as she prepared to return to her work with the federal task force. "He taught me that memory is sacred responsibility, that witnesses carry the obligation to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves." She looked back at the 17 graves that represented girls who died waiting for justice. "They waited long enough, Tom. But they didn't wait in vain." As she walked away from the memorial garden toward her wagon loaded with maps and testimonies that would guide the next federal investigation, Ayana carried with her the voices of 47 girls whose names would never be forgotten. The keeper of names had become the teacher of justice, and her father's ancient wisdom was reshaping the American frontier one rescued victim at a time. The girl who'd drawn maps in the dirt had become the woman who mapped justice across a territory where the vulnerable were no longer forgotten, and their suffering was no longer ignored. And in Apache tradition, that made her memory sacred, her testimony powerful, and her legacy eternal. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you that even in the darkest times truth can triumph over evil, then subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, justice, and the power of one person to change everything. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible true stories from America's frontier, where ordinary people found extraordinary strength to fight for what was right.